class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 46 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Anaheim Ducks, in which the Sharks have won 5-3. And the Sharks opened their season with an extremely rough stretch of play, not only because they opened the year with 11 straight losses, but also because the schedule making was not particularly kind to them. For the first time in NHL history, the Sharks were a team who faced off against the previous year's 4 division winners when the Sharks played Vegas, Colorado, Carolina, and Boston in their first 4 games of this season. But because that opening part of their schedule was so difficult, the latter half of the schedule that the Sharks currently find themselves in is significantly easier. In fact, I believe the Sharks have one of, if not the easiest schedule to end this season out of any team in the entire league. And that was on full display over this last 5 stretch of games for the San Jose Sharks, where they faced off against the Canadiens, the Senators, the Sabres, the Blackhawks, and tonight against the Anaheim Ducks. The best team out of those 5 groups is the Montreal Canadiens, who are 25th last in the league. And as such, this means that the Sharks actually have a decent shot of winning these games that they are playing. They won against that Montreal Canadiens team. They had a close one against the Chicago Blackhawks and the Ottawa Senators, and here tonight they are winners again against the Anaheim Ducks. But this game didn't really start off all that well for the Sharks. While the first period would go scoreless between these two squads, the Sharks were heavily outshot and pretty heavily outchanced as well. While not a dominant performance from Anaheim through 20 minutes, it was quite clear that the Ducks were the better team here tonight to start. And through the first half of the second period, that continued. In fact, halfway through this game, the San Jose Sharks had just 2 shots on net. Now, admittedly, the Sharks have had some really low shot totals this entire season, just due to the fact that they are, of course, the last place team in the league, as well as one of the lowest scoring teams in, honestly, NHL history. But 2 shots is like a season low for the halfway mark, so things were not looking good at that point, and yet through the latter half of this game, the Sharks turned things around, and they turned things around in a very big and obvious way. Not only do they score the first goal of this game with one from Marc-Edouard Vlasic, as it was an unlikely suspect night for Sharks goal scorers here against Anaheim, the game then does get tied back up, but then it is Burrows and Zetterlund, with Burrows getting his first as a San Jose Shark, to make it 3-1 San Jose, and it looked as though the Sharks were going to take that lead into the third period, but in the dying seconds, it is Adam Henrique who cuts it to within 1. And we know historically, not just for the Sharks, but for every NHL team, when you give up that goal right before the intermission, it really gives that team a ton of momentum heading into the third. And yet, the Sharks managed to stave off anything that the Ducks were trying to do, and in fact played themselves an extremely dominant third period, kind of like what the Ducks did to the Sharks in the first period, with Jan Rutta getting his first as a San Jose Shark. McTavish does cut the lead back to 1 late in the third period on the power play, before Hertl, with an empty netter, secures the victory for the San Jose Sharks 5-3. So obviously a really tough start for San Jose. The first 30 minutes were not particularly pretty at all, but the last 30 minutes, the Sharks looked like a really strong team against an admittedly very weak opponent in the Anaheim Ducks. But of course, the Sharks also a weak team themselves, so maybe this is just par for the course, as it has been over these past few games when these two low-ranked teams play against each other. A lot of volatility and maybe not the best hockey being played, but at the very least, you can still find some excitement out of it then. Moving on to the players to talk about, of course, the big news for the night was the return of Logan Couture to the lineup. He's missed at this point the entire season, so the first 45 games of the year, due to a lower body injury, but he draws back into the lineup here finally tonight against Anaheim. In lesser news, but still very notable, it is also Nico Sturm who draws back into the lineup after missing 16 games straight. What's most interesting about Nico Sturm's return is that while he was out, the Sharks, of those 16 games, only managed to win a single one, showing that perhaps maybe a coincidence, but perhaps also that Nico Sturm is a very important part of this San Jose Sharks roster on and likely also off the ice. But let us start off first of all with the top line of Zetterlund, Hertl, and Hoffman. And I actually want to start off this conversation with Mike Hoffman. He has been, I've mentioned this multiple times, one of the most hit or miss players on the San Jose Sharks this year. There are games in which he just looks like a replaceable AHL type of forward, and then other games where he actually looks like an extremely good top six player. This was a case for the latter. Hoffman had one of his best games in teal for the San Jose Sharks. It really looked like he was all over the ice in the offensive zone. Fantastic job offensively throughout this game. Even defensively, had a couple of slick plays near the opponent's blue line to help get these pucks out of the zone. I thought Hoffman just had a really, really good performance here tonight, which was quite nice to see. Tomas Hertl, a bit of a struggle to start this game, which is not really that much of a surprise considering the Sharks as a whole only had 2 shots in the first 30 minutes, but the latter half was pretty much the Tomas Hertl show, I guess you could say, as he was just showing off that dominant aspect of his game that we know he has, but he doesn't necessarily manage to show it off all that often, at least over these past couple of seasons, because the team has been so bad. But it was definitely one of those games for Hertl. It was nice to see him as well get rewarded with the empty netter after he had so many great shifts early on. Also had the assist on the Jan Rutta goal, or no, he didn't have the assist on the Jan Rutta goal, but he was on the ice at the very least for that one. So just generally a really good game for Hertl, at least in the later half of it. Fabian Zetterlund, also pretty strong game, I would say. A goal and an assist, actually ties Tomas Hertl in terms of the team lead for goals with his on a very, very nice shot, and it's pretty impressive to be able to beat a goaltender of John Gibson's caliber with a shot like that. So definitely nice to see him made up an effective first line for the San Jose Sharks. Moving on to the second line, we of course have to start off with Couture. Now, was it an outstanding game for Couture? It was not, but that is extremely understandable. 45 games missed, didn't really get to have much of a training camp either due to that injury manifesting during that time, and so it was always going to be an opportunity to ease Couture back up to NHL speed. But even early on, where he was not necessarily generating tons of offensive chances, he was clearly very engaged with the game in a physical sense, putting up multiple hits here tonight, and eventually the offense did start to pop up a bit more, and even got his first point of the season on the Sharks' first goal of the game on an assist to Mark-Edouard Vlasic, one of the only other long-standing San Jose Sharks players. Couture, Vlasic, and Hertl are pretty much the only 3 last man standing from the glory days of the San Jose Sharks, more or less. So it was definitely nice to see them combined, and Couture, I would say, just generally had a pretty positive output type of game. When it comes to his wingers, I want to start off with William Eklund, and it was a very weird game for Eklund for sure, because through the first half of this game, when the Sharks really weren't generating anything, I thought Eklund was one of the Sharks' better forwards of the night. Some really strong puck touches in the offensive zone, actually had some decent chemistry with Logan Couture, which is semi-surprising considering he hasn't played a game this entire season, and so Eklund doesn't really have a lot of experience with number 39. And yet, for whatever reason, though I guess it's not that much of a surprise considering it's happened before this year, Eklund gets demoted in favor of Anthony Duclair, who jumps up to the top 6. Now, for the first time with one of these demotions, I don't actually have an issue with who gets his spot in the top 6. I thought Duclair had a couple of really solid shifts with the 4th line, deserved to be bumped back up to that top 6, and ended up finishing off the game quite well, though I'll get to that a bit later. The issue that I took with it is because Eklund was playing quite well up to that point. And I don't know if it's a coincidence what ends up happening after this, or perhaps is just a direct result of what the demotion itself, but Eklund gets dropped down to a line with Cunnin and Sturm and ends up just completely falling off for the rest of the game and not looking nearly as effective, and in fact looks relatively bad in that 3rd line role. So I said it's perhaps a coincidence, but there could also be a situation where Eklund, maybe he thinks he's actually having a good game up to this point, feels like he's really rolling with a couple of solid line mates in Couture and Barabanov, and then even so gets demoted, sees as though he's getting punished for something that he thought he was doing pretty well, and maybe that's why the game ends up falling off in the latter half here. So again, That's pure speculation. I can't really say that there's anything confirmed with that, but it wouldn't necessarily surprise me, and it does cap off a, like I said, pretty weird game for Eklund, all things considered. The player who I thought could have easily been demoted for Anthony Duclair jumping up to that second line was Barabanov, as he felt like as though he was the odd man out on that second line through the first half of this game, really wasn't doing much of anything, and while he wasn't really a liability either, there weren't actually any positives in Barabanov's game, and compared to William Eklund, who has had some really strong games this season, Barabanov, yes, there have been some injuries that he has dealt with, but he's never really had a takeover type of performance this season, and he hasn't even really had like a great performance either. And so to see him keep up that top 6 spot, even though he's not really doing anything, meanwhile Eklund gets dropped to the third line, was rather surprising and also kind of disappointing too. I don't think Barabanov was all that great. Moving on to the third line, we have Sturm, Kunin, and Zadina. First of all, starting with Kunin, all around, I would say it wasn't a great game for Kunin. Defensively, I thought he had a few issues in his game, but I will say, at the very least, he did have a couple of close offensive chances, which I guess is somewhat nice to see, so he does have that going for him. When it comes to Nico Sturm, like I mentioned, returned to the lineup here tonight after missing 16 games, an important piece for the San Jose Sharks. It was expected that this might lead to an improvement in the Sharks' penalty kill, and that was a nice start to the game for the Sharks' penalty kill, but they would end up giving up their usual power play goal right near the end. That would make it 4-3 San Jose. Nico Sturm, though, I do think did a good part in that penalty killing situation, had some strong plays in the last few minutes in the 6-on-5 situation, killing off with Tomas Hertl, important on the face-off draw for the San Jose Sharks. So all in all, a pretty decent return game for Sturm. And then when it comes to Filip Zadina, wasn't a super noticeable game for him, but he did have a couple of moments of actually had a goal called off in this game. Not exactly one that he set up beautifully himself, but really just off of a lucky bounce, but finds himself in front of the net to be able to slam that home. Of course, it was called back for the offside, one of the most obvious offsides we have seen this year. Even in real time, I saw that entry and thought, wasn't that clearly offside? And indeed it was, but he did sort of get in there, I guess, and had a couple of decent chances. In fact, there was a really strong shift in the early part of the third period where Zadina got a really good look, but otherwise not exactly doing a ton. And then when it comes to the fourth line, obviously Duclair, like I mentioned, a couple of really strong shifts for the fourth line in the first period, which allowed him to get bumped up to the top 6, so I had zero issue with David Quinn doing that. I also didn't necessarily have much of an issue with Duclair starting this game on the fourth line. When it comes to the other two players here, Carpenter, not super noticeable. Bailey, really unnoticeable. Probably the least effective forward for the San Jose Sharks this night, as I don't think he was bad necessarily, but I didn't exactly notice him too much either. When it comes from a defensive standpoint, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Vlasic. Vlasic, just with the easier level of competition that the San Jose Sharks have been playing against recently, it has really helped Vlasic sort of ease back into the game here. Obviously, he hasn't been very good at all thus far this season. He hasn't been very good at all thus far in the past 4 years either, but he's had a solid stretch of games recently, and in fact is even getting up there offensively on the rush, which is what's incredibly surprising from Vlasic, right? It's one thing to just be at the blue line and send pucks towards the net, which is what we have been seeing from Vlasic for the past 5 years of his game, but it's a completely different thing to be joining up in the rush, to be putting yourself in these strong offensive positions. We saw it against the Ottawa Senators when he scored his first goal of the season on a beautiful sort of delayed third or fourth man back on that play, and here tonight we saw a 2-on-1 type of situation with Logan Couture, and it was very surprising to see Vlasic be that guy on the 2-on-1, and yet here we are. So a bit of a small sort of rejuvenation, I guess you could say, for Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Now, how long will this last? I don't exactly know. Probably not very long, as the Sharks are now heading into a slightly tougher stretch of games with the Los Angeles Kings and then the New York Rangers coming up. That might sort of change things for Vlasic, but for now we are enjoying this part of the season for him. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda. Thrun, I thought, had a bit of a struggling start to this game. Not necessarily his best, fanned on a couple of his passes, which looked a bit scary. But as the game went on, he became very reliable and very good from an offensive standpoint as well. Was on the ice actually for 6-on-5 situations, so clearly a good amount of trust put into him by David Quinn, as has really been the case for Thrun over these past couple of weeks, and is continuing to develop into a very strong and reliable defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, really looking like a decent top 4 guy for this team, and that's hopefully what the Sharks can get out of Henry Thrun, considering they traded with this Anaheim Ducks team a 3rd-round pick to acquire him. Jan Ruda, very nice to see him be able to get his first goal as a San Jose Sharks, and he also had quite the solid game as he continues to complement Henry Thrun as a defensive partner very, very well. And then when it comes to this third pairing, I thought Ohotiuk actually stood out in a pretty solid way for the San Jose Sharks. Some good plays. Near the start of the game, there were a couple of struggles, like with much of the San Jose Sharks team, but as it went on, while his shifts did somewhat diminish, when he was on the ice, playing pretty well. And then when it comes to Kyle Burroughs, gets his first goal as the San Jose Sharks. Pretty nice to see 3 defensemen on the night for San Jose manage to get goals. That's like more goals than the Sharks had from defensemen pretty much this entire season, which is an overstatement, but not really by all that much, which just goes to show how little offense that the Sharks have been getting from their defensemen, which is not that much of a surprise, but still. And then when it comes to the goaltender, we have Mackenzie Blackwood. He had a pretty okay night against Chicago. Wasn't really tasked with doing much, but still only let in 1 goal through regulation and overtime play. And so he gets another outing here tonight against the Anaheim Ducks. Made a few really, really good saves. Obviously does still let in 3 goals, so it's not necessarily an outstanding night, but it may have been perhaps enough to get the next start for the San Jose Sharks on Monday. Of course, with it being, I believe, a back-to-back situation, I'm not 100% sure about that. It'll likely be a Blackwood-Kakinen trade-off, but Blackwood, decent game here tonight for sure. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, like I said, on Monday, where they will face off against the Los Angeles Kings. The Kings are one of the better teams in the Pacific Division. They were at one point like 2nd or 1st even in that division, but they've been on a massive losing streak out of late to like rival the San Jose Sharks, and so they've kind of tumbled down the standings pretty considerably. The Sharks, it's an opportunity to strike, I guess, but it's also, I guess, sort of an opportunity for the Kings to break out of their tough losing streak with a matchup against the worst team in the league. Class dismissed.